My name is Walt DeBoni, and I would like to thank you for joining us for our opening ceremonies and the presentation of When Avenues Collide. Tonight, we have a double-header event with remarks by Mayor Nenshi, followed by a presentation by Doug Coates. Mayor Nenshi has now joined us, and I think we will now proceed with his comments. Over to you, Mayor Nenshi.
You know, one of the funniest things about my job is that when we are in real life, and I've got a million events all at once, I will walk into a room and someone will see me and say, the mayor's here, and they will rush me up to stage and I will start speaking before I have any idea what room I'm in. So I always sort of have to guess as to where I am. So that just happened virtually. So I hope this is actually the Lions Club. I don't think it is because I saw Waltz. So this must be the kickoff to Historic Calgary Week. And what a pleasure it is to be here with all of you again this year for my last time to join you as mayor on the kickoff to Historic Calgary Week. This one, of course, looks very different, but it has always been a great pleasure for me to get together with you all in this last week of July and talk about the places from which we've come. And before I begin, let's just say a special thank you to everyone from the Chinook Country Historical Society, and especially my friend, one of my great local heroes, Walt DeBoni, and all of the great work Walt and Irene have done for our community and that all of you continue to do with us every single day. And so I am thrilled to be here with all of you. I've caught my breath now. And I'm happy to spend a little bit of time today chatting with you about some of the importance of history and why I think it's important for us to understand where we've come from as we make decisions on where we want to go and where we want to be. So Walt made a big mistake because he said, you know, usually, Mayor, you're so short in your statements when we kick off Historic Calgary Week, which is not true. But today he said, you know, it's your last one. Feel free to take a little bit more time. He is going to regret that. But let's start at the beginning. So you see behind me here is a picture of Elbow River Camp at the Calgary Stampede. And I love this picture because it has so much in it. It's got a rolling in prairie thunderstorm. It's got the rivers. It's got the modern gleaming office buildings of downtown Calgary. It was actually took place during the Stampede, hence why the teepees are there. So you can see a little bit of the festivity of the Calgary Stampede in the corner. Of course, the picture was taken from Scotsman's Hill. You got the Saddle Dome behind my head there. And so there's a lot going on here, and a lot that tells us a lot about who we are and who we have been as a community. So we'll start, of course, with the fact that you see the Elbow River there. You actually see the point of the Elbow River just before it merges with the Bow, a place that the Blackfoot call Mokinstis, the Elbow, the place where two rivers come together. And that really is our origin story. For many, many, many thousands of years, people have come to this place, and they've been drawn here by the water. Because this is, and boy, are the farmers ever remembering that this year, this is a semi-arid region. It doesn't actually rain or snow very much here. So the water is what brings life. And people have been drawn to this land because of the water. And since time immemorial, for thousands of generations, people have come, they've wintered here. They've come here to hunt and to fish and to trade, to live, to love, to dream, to dance, to fight sometimes, and to engage in all of those activities that make us human. And so I love that in the last few years, it's become traditional to start every gathering. Nowadays, even weddings and funerals that I go to start with a land acknowledgement. But I worry that it may become rote for us. It may just become something we say, instead of understanding that it's not just an acknowledgement of the past, but it's a statement about who we are today. And it's a promise about the future, that we will act in accordance with that treaty, that even if our ancestors weren't here to sign that treaty, number 7, We are all bound by it, and we are all treaty people. So it's appropriate for us to start Historic Calgary Week by honoring Nitsitapi. It just means the people. We call them the people of the Blackfoot Confederacy now, the Siksika, the Kainai, and the Piikani First Nations. We honor the people of the mountains, the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, of the Chiniki, the Wesley, and the Bearspaw Nations. Our closest neighbors weren't always our closest neighbors, but that's where their nation is now. They're called the Beaver people, the Tsuut'ina Nation. And of course, this place wouldn't be what it is without the contributions of the Métis people, with their deep connection to the land and their deep history here. One of the most interesting things I think that's happened during COVID is that one of my favorite historical sites in Calgary, Lougheed House, is now calling itself a Métis home, because of course Lady Lougheed was a Métis person. And to me, these are the kinds of threads that are coming together as we think about our history. And this has been a rough year. There's no nice way of saying it. I've been nice all year saying, we've been learning, we've been building community together during this year, but it's been a very, very difficult year for us all. And I hope that as we move forward, I'm not interested in going back to normal. I think we can do better than that. I think we can do better than that as we build an even stronger community going forward. And I'll also say, maybe I'll get a little political. I'm not long for politics, so I can get a little political. That it irks me when a certain Alberta politician who shall remain unnamed tells us that this is going to be the best summer ever. I don't think that's true. I think it's going to be a summer of great optimism, of turning the page towards something better. But I also think we all have to process what we've been through this last year. We've been through a lot of trauma. We've lost a lot. We've lost people close to us. Many of us have lost our livelihoods. My niece lost her high school graduation. Brides and grooms lost their weddings. Many people this summer are just now turning to doing a celebration of life for their loved ones that they lost. So for them, it's not going to be the best summer ever. And I think together, we have to determine how we're going to move as a community, how people are going to move at different paces, but how we are going to use all of this time and everything we've learned to figure out how we build better, how we build a stronger community together. And that's one of the reasons that I've always been so interested in history, because for me, understanding where we come from is critical to help us decide where we want to go. And ultimately, I think that's where I hope that Historic Calgary Week, the Chinook Country Historical Society, and the great work we're doing about understanding where we've come from is ultimately useful. It's not useful just because it's interesting. It's useful because it helps us determine where we want to go. And so, thank you so much for that note in the chat. I meant to say that at the beginning, which is, although I'm going to go on forever because that's what I do, what I really want to do is have a great conversation with you and take advantage of the time that we've got a little more, take advantage of the fact that we've got a little more time to get together. So please submit your questions to the Q&A, and I would love to answer them. And frankly, ask me anything. This might be your last chance while I'm the mayor. Ask me about anything. If you ask me about the pothole in front of your house, I'll say call 311. But beyond that, I'd be thrilled to engage in any kind of conversation with you. But what Walt asked me to do is take you on a little virtual tour of some of my favorite places in Calgary and the things they make me think about. And so we can start right here at Elbow River Camp, right here at Mohkinstsis. And when I look at that river, the Elbow River, I think about a lot of things. As you all know, one of the great pleasures of a Calgary summer is taking a float up the Elbow River. I don't call it rafting because it's so gentle, usually. You're not really rafting. People will float on it in every conveyance of anything that floats, a child's wading pool, an air mattress. Just wear your PFD, please. And that used to be one of my great pleasures. I used to love to float on the Elbow on a warm summer's day, to the point where I actually kept, when I worked at Mount Royal University, I actually kept a cheap inflatable raft in the trunk of my car. So if I got off work and it was a pleasant evening, I'd round up a friend, because you need a vehicle at the beginning and a vehicle at the end, and we just go for a float on the Elbow River. I haven't been on the Elbow River since the summer of 2012. You can imagine why. Because, of course, when I think about that river, I think about 2013. And I just can't bear to go back on the river when I think about 2013. And ultimately, when I think about that, I think about how that river, normally so gentle and such an easy float, became so angry. And last week, I got to stand on the banks of the river near the Repsol Center in a place called Lindsay Park with the federal and provincial governments and talk about how we're building a new dam at Springbank that will protect the Elbow River from flooding at the 2013 level. But when I was there, I also looked across the river and looked at the apartment buildings in the community of Mission and remembered Lorraine. Lorraine had spent her life volunteering and working for the Salvation Army. She never learned to drive, and after her husband passed, she still continued to contribute to the community because she had the Calgary Transit route map memorized. And her friends would call her and say, "How do I get anywhere on transit?" And I thought to myself, you know what? I think I could have been friends with Lorraine. I think we'd have a lot of fun together. But of course, I learned all those facts about her at her funeral. Because Lorraine, you see, had decided on that fateful Friday night in 2020 that when her apartment building was being evacuated, she was going to look after everyone's cats and everyone's belongings. She lived on the ground floor, and she had a key, you see, to her neighbor's house on the third or fourth floor. So she thought if the water started to rise, she'd just go upstairs with her cat and she'd be fine. She didn't expect it to come so quickly and so angrily and with such force. So when I look back and think about all that the Elbow River has given us, I also remember our responsibility to look after people like Lorraine. Coming a little bit further up the river, in behind me, you see a place that I still think of as the Olympic Saddle Dome, which brings me great memories of 1988 and being 16 years old and how we showed the world who we are. Now, of course, the Saddle Dome may not be with us for much longer, which is a real shame. But it really is a great opportunity for us to remember how sport and culture and art bring us together. We go down the road a little bit from the Saddle Dome. You pass the magnificent new Central Library, one of my favorite places in the city, because it's not just about architecture, it's about community. You go past the King Eddie, the place of the blues in Canada for so many years, now revitalized and reopened with a magnificent rooftop patio. You end up at City Hall. City Hall has 3 buildings. The first building was built in 1911. The second one, where my office is, was built in the 1960s. Nobody even knows it's there because it's hidden by the other 2 buildings. And the big blue building was completed in 1985. About 5,000 of my colleagues work there, including me. And I love to think about that old building, that 1911 building. Because you see, between 1908 and 1911, the population of Calgary had increased by 10 times. So you think you know a boom. Imagine that boom. Yet it was still a city of about 20,000 people when they built that building with that imposing clock tower. And that building was a community center and a stables. It had a barbershop in it, as well as the council chambers. And I often, when I'm going to work and walking to my office through that magnificent building, I think to myself, you know, those folks back in 1911, they didn't build this city hall for a town of 20,000 people. They built it for what they were dreaming to be, because they knew that there was an incredibly special future in favor of them. Earlier this week, I got the chance to open a new park in Calgary, probably the last park that'll open while I'm mayor, called the Lois Sabo Commons. It was a special moment for me because it was recognizing a piece of our history that we don't often recognize. I often talk at this event about how I'm really obsessed with naming things. And I think we should name things after people. And that's where I'm going to wrap up my conversation in just a second here. I think we should. A lot of folks are saying, well, we should stop naming things after people because they might be controversial later and it'll cause drama later. And I don't believe that. I believe that we can have conversations about that. And I'll come back to that in a second. But I also said 11 years ago, I want to make sure we're recognizing all of our history. I want to make sure we're recognizing the women who built Calgary. I want to make sure we're recognizing people whose names always don't appear in the history books. And I was so thrilled to call it Lois Szabo Commons, this brand new park. If you don't know who Lois is, because she's still very much with us, Lois was one of the very first LGBTQ activists in Calgary. In 1970, she and some friends opened the Calgary's first gay social club, the Carousel Club, Club Carousel. It's only 2 years after homosexuality was decriminalized in Canada. And although decriminalized, it certainly wasn't accepted. And Lois built that place. I teased her. I said she did it for the big bucks. She did not. She was a volunteer. But she built that place because that was just a place where people could go and be themselves. And I love the fact that in the heart of the Beltline, across from Cafe Bino, there is now a park where the next generation of activists will sit under those trees and dream about the future. So continue with me on my little tour, if you don't mind, and we will get on the C train at City Hall Station, the blue line going north. We're going to get off at Franklin Station. We're going to cross the busy Memorial Drive and walk up a not very pedestrian-friendly hill to a very nondescript strip mall. It's called Short Pants Plaza, the most ridiculous name. And I have no idea why it's called Short Pants Plaza, but I love Short Pants Plaza. I love it because in one little strip mall with 30 parking spots, you see all of Calgary. You see the Safari Grill. That's my community. That's Afro-Indian fusion. You see the Village Pita Bakery, where I go on Eid, and this week is Eid for the Muslim community, and buy the best pita bread and the best meat pies in the city. Next door to Village Pita is Lloyd's, home of the best Jamaican patties in the city. Across, there's a Filipino place where you can get really interesting Filipino desserts, and on and on and on. And as we think about the history of Calgary, I think we need to think about that diversity of the city, of people who have come from every corner of what I call this broken earth to build a community here. And that's really where the last thought that I want to leave you with today, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions, and then we'll get to the speech you're actually here for. But one of the other things that happened in this terrible year, I often say that we were dealing with 5 simultaneous crises: a public health pandemic, a mental health and addictions pandemic, an economic crisis, an environmental crisis, and the climate emergency, and a real reckoning for many of us for the first time ever on the idea of racism and anti-racism. This has been hard for a lot of us. It's been hard for a lot of us because we have been so incredibly proud of what we've built here in Canada. I am. I talk about it around the world all the time. I talk about how Canada in general and Calgary in particular are probably, as the Aga Khan has called us, the most successful example of pluralism in human history. And I'm really proud of that. But over the last year, we've also heard that that is not the reality for everyone who shares this land with us. It's not the reality for Indigenous people. It's not the reality for Black people. It's not the reality for lots of people of color. They live a different life than we do. Even as a person of color, I can say that because I speak English well, because I'm educated, because I'm in a position of authority, because people sometimes, occasionally, not in my family, listen to what I have to say. And so how do we reconcile those things? How do we reconcile the fact that we believe in history and we never, ever want to erase history with the fact that that history has too often excluded too many people? And how do we do that in a way that allows us to build a future together? This summer, many of us have had our hearts opened to the issue of reconciliation in a way that we never have before because of the horrifying discoveries across the country of the remains of children at residential schools. And for those of us who know history, it would be easy to be a bit put out by that, to say to our neighbors and our friends, how did you not know? We've always known. The first report on residential schools and abuse at residential schools was written in 1907. Residential schools stayed around for 90 years beyond that. The TV show Friends was on the air when the last residential school closed. But we knew. We've listened to the elders. We've listened to the survivors. We knew. How could you not have known? You know what? That's not the right way to go. The right way to go is for us to truly understand that even though this may feel too late, it is far from too little. That it is our opportunity while people's hearts are open to fill them with hope for the future, but with a true understanding of history and of where we've come from. Elder Casey Eagle, speaker, told me last week, stop saying reconciliation. It's time for reconciliation. And I would argue that it's also time for a real move to anti-racism. So what does that mean? Should we be worried about cancel culture? Should we be worried that we're erasing history by saying that maybe we should change names of schools, or maybe we should move monuments or take them down? Certainly, if you're the Premier of Alberta, you're very worried about cancel culture. And when asked about the changing of the name of Langevin School, Premier Kenney, who, to be fair, had not heard of the change of the name and had not been prepared for that, went off on a long tangent about our first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, and how he would be very offended if anyone wanted to change anything named after John A. Macdonald, a great hero of his. And I was listening to that, and the first thing I thought was, well, geez, you can't complain about cancel culture when you're talking about residential schools, which was actually an attempt to actually cancel an actual culture. But I want to tell you a story. The day after he made those comments happened to be the Mayor's Environment Expo. And normally that's at City Hall, and there's tons of kids, and they have trifolds, and they tell you about their environmental projects that they did. This year it was all virtual. So I had appointments with various schools who were going to tell me about their environmental projects. And the very first school was Sir John A. Macdonald School. It's in Northwest Calgary, shares a field with John Diefenbaker High School. It's two different prime ministers of two different eras in the same field. And I thought, geez, I wonder if I should ask them what they think about the name of their school. And then I said, no, that's not nice. They've been working for a whole year on this environmental project. Let's hear their environmental project. So I turned on the screen and I saw these kids all in their orange t-shirts. And normally these projects are, we've learned how to do worm composting in our classroom, or we've learned how to reduce electricity use in our school, very cool stuff. But these kids were in their orange t-shirts, and they started by saying, what we're about to talk to you about our environmental project, we do with a full understanding of the weight of history, with a full understanding of the weight of who we are and the privilege that we hold. And we do so understanding the heaviness of the name of our school. And they proceeded to tell me about their environmental project, which was in conjunction with John Diefenbaker School, changing the field between those two schools into an Indigenous garden, where they were working with a Siksika elder to really understand what that meant. And they said, so it doesn't matter what happens to the name of our school. What matters is that people who come here understand that the kids today in 2021 understood walking on the path to reconciliation. They understood what it meant to go to anti-racism. I don't mind telling you, I cried, they cried. It was very emotional. I never got around to asking them about the environmental aspects of their school and their project. But I walked away from there going, you know what? The kids are going to be all right. Because ultimately we can tie ourselves in knots in these debates, and we can paint ourselves into corners, and we can rail one against one another, and we can divide. But the kids are just making a path forward that makes sense for us all. And to me, that's why learning about our history and understanding our history matters so very much. It's not about holding on. It's not about you being defensive. It's not about using history as a weapon to divide. It's about using history to help us understand this place works because neighbors built barns for one another. This place works because the first Calgary Stampede invited the First Nations people to the gates at a time when they legally couldn't leave their reserves. This place works because we make it work. This place works because the community of Marlborough looked after a first-generation working-class kid and gave him all kinds of opportunities and gave him a chance at success and wanted him to succeed, and then elected him mayor. Ultimately, that's what works. And I hope that as we move forward, as we understand where we've come from, we move forward in a spirit of kindness and compassion and empathy and mercy and love and we reject that division and mean-spiritedness and hatred all around us. And that's why it's important for us to know our history. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you for joining us. We do have a few questions for you.
All right, I will answer them lightning round so we can get to our next speaker.
Okay. The first one is from Mark. Many citizens took up your challenge for 3 things to do for Calgary. What were your 3 highlights of what you accomplished for our fine city? Thank you very much for your excellent leadership and wisdom. We are much better off because of your service and dedication.
Thanks so much, Marg. I feel like I need to punt on that question a little bit because it's so hard to think of just 3 things. You know, it's easy to talk about things that we built. And I am particularly proud of that background behind Zorica. I think that is one of the most magnificent public spaces ever built anywhere in the world. And I take a teensy bit of credit for it. I love it so very much. And in fact, I believe where you're sitting is just opposite the Walt and Irene DeBoney Local History Library, which is an amazing part of what we do together in our community. So there are lots of things we built, roads and transit and that sort of thing. But, you know, the thing I think the most about is if you think back to 2010, politics was kind of rigid. Voter turnout was very low. People thought of government as something that happens to them, not something that happens with and for them. And I love that there is so much more engagement now. I love that people are really trying to be a part of their future. And if I can take even a teensy bit of credit for that, and especially through 3 Things for Canada, I love that. And by the way, in my retirement, I don't know what I'm going to do yet. Something quiet, I hope. But one of the things I want to do is I want to take that big giant number 3 with me and revitalize 3 Things for Canada, the simple social movement that just asks every Canadian every year to do at least 3 acts of community service.
Thank you. We also have a question from Cynthia. Would you be interested in getting involved in heritage advocacy after your time as a mayor?
Hey, Cynthia, thanks for all that you do for heritage and continue to do in our community. Yeah, probably. I got a lot of things on my plate. So first of all, I'm going to catch up on 10 years of TV. But if there are ways that I can be helpful and that my knowledge and limited skills can be useful, I'd be very happy to be as helpful as I can.
Thank you. And next question is about the 100-year-old tree.
My favorite tree.
At Stampede, yes. So someone is wondering what is going to happen with that tree now that we have a new development happening there.
We're going to try real hard to save that tree. And oh my gosh, it's expensive to save that tree, but it's worth it. I was just shocked when I heard how much it cost. It's old, so I don't want to make promises that I can't keep. I want to make sure that it can be moved and it can survive and thrive in its new location, but it survived and thrived in a parking lot for a really long time. So for me, that's actually pretty important. And I would like to, I'd like to save it and do as much as we can in order to do it.
Thank you. That would be great. I would love to see being saved as well. The next question is from Gregory. I agree in avoiding canceling history on controversial events and figures. What is the city process for evaluating and adjusting historical monuments that need more context to help educate rather than eliminate monuments?
You know, thanks so much for that question. It's a complicated one. So to answer the question straight up, I will say that there is no city process. You know, we're working on this. In the meantime, we're looking at it on a case-by-case basis. And, you know, for example, renaming the Langevin Bridge to the Reconciliation Bridge was actually a very, very easy decision. Mr. Langevin, and same in Toronto where they're talking about renaming Dundas Street. Mr. Dundas had never set foot in Toronto. He was just a friend of one of the people who started Toronto and, you know, extended slavery for many, many years. So as logistically difficult as it is, it's not hard. That said, sometimes you don't want to, and so the city is working on processes. And what we did with the Langevin Bridge, now the Reconciliation Bridge, is if you're to walk across it, you would see that there's actually a very big plaque. It's 3 parts. I know because I wrote it, that really tries to contextualize all of the history explaining why it was named after Langevin, explaining why City Council chose to change the name, explaining what we are thinking about the future. And I think that's important. You know, there are some people you don't want to monumentalize. The discussion in the US around Confederate monuments is a funny one because, you know, those Confederate monuments are not that old. They were actually put in place in the last 50 or 60 years deliberately to antagonize members of the African American community. And, you know, as I always say, there are no monuments to Hitler in Germany, but everybody knows who he was. And it's not about erasing the history. It's about understanding what we honor and what we monumentalize. So you think of someone like Sir John A. Macdonald, a lot of good, a lot of bad. This country wouldn't exist without him. No one is ever going to forget Sir John A. Macdonald. And in the world that I'm in personally, I would say, yeah, leave his name on the school, but also understand his complex history. Some would say take his name off the school, but we will still not erase him. He's still the first prime minister. We will still always know of him. And so I think that's really where we get. Zrika, I'm going to let you skip the next question because I can see it.
Yes, okay, thank you.
I will answer it quickly so you don't have to say it, which is, this is the most important election in a generation. You got to get involved. You got to volunteer and give money to candidates that you think are the candidates who will stand for you. You got to get your friends to vote. It is incredibly important to make sure that we get people who can bring our city forward and not backwards, and perhaps not the person that you mentioned there.
Oh, thank you so much. And we do have one more question, but before that, I would just quickly like to read two comments.
All right.
One says, such a thoughtful, insightful talk with much for us to think about, Mayor Nenshi. That is from Ellen. You have learned so much in your work as a mayor. We will miss you in that role. Looking forward to what you choose to be involved with in future. And also from Wendy, bravo, Mayor Nenshi, motivating and inspiring talk. Thank you. And then the last question, I don't think we have more time, unfortunately, but the last question would be, what will you miss most about being a mayor?
Well, obviously, I'll miss meeting all of you in July at the Southern Alberta Pioneers Lodge. Hopefully, I'll still be able to do that. You know what I'm going to miss the most? I mean, it's cliche, but it's so true. I'm going to miss the people. The best thing about this job is even if I had 30 events to go to on a Saturday, which happened before COVID, that means there were 30 opportunities to meet people who are doing amazing things. And when I think about the number of, I see Walt's on the screen, so I'll say, if I think about the number of times my life has intersected with Walt and Irene, whether it's history or music or the arts in the community, I'm not sure I would have known them had I not been the mayor. And so the really important thing for me is going to be to still know and hopefully amplify the stories of amazing people doing great things in the community. But while I may enjoy having an occasional Saturday night at home with the family, I am really going to miss all of the people. But thank you all so very much for all of your support of me personally over the years. Thank you for your service, for your seva. I always talk about seva and how we are all called to do seva, which means selfless service. And I am reminded of the first words I said on that sweaty basement in October 18th, 2010, when I made that victory speech. The very first thing I said is, today Calgary is better than it was yesterday. And it's not because of me. It's because of you. And so thank you for taking a risk on me, but also thank you for doing what we do. We have a city full of 1.5 million people doing amazing things for one another every day, and we are going to be awesome going forward.
Well, thank you for your service on my personal behalf and on behalf of the library. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Now we'll move on to our next speaker, and I would like to introduce Doug Coates.
Thank you very much, Walt, and welcome to When Avenues Collide. I'm the kind of guy that if you put a map in front of me, I'll be lost in it for hours. And that's how this talk came about, from looking at old maps and going, oh. Now, you know that avenues aren't supposed to collide because they're parallel. And in the inner city of Calgary, where the grid system is still there, we get so used to that. It's very precise. It's almost mathematically precise that when once in a while you see something odd like this sign, or these signs, it's weird. It doesn't fit the pattern. And you wonder, why is it like that? There must have been a reason, but what was it? Well, here's an example of what I mean. We're outside Elbow Park School. Why does the sidewalk make that bend? Well, to go around the tree. But it's a young tree and a brand new sidewalk, and they didn't have to put the tree there, and they didn't have to bend the sidewalk around it. We have a mystery. Well, let's look at it from the other direction. Oh, there's a big old tree stump. Now we can put a story together. The big old tree had to be cut down. Taking out the stump was too much work, so they cut it off flush to the ground, put in a new tree, and curved the new sidewalk around both of them. But 50 years from now, the little tree will be big, the old stump will have rotted away, and everyone will assume the sidewalk was curved because of the tree, and they'll wonder why the city didn't center the curve around the tree. In fact, only 6 years later, it's already happening. Today, the stump has all but disappeared, and you can tell from the worn dirt path that people think the city made a mistake. So today, when we see something weird like this, we're looking at it from this direction, and we wonder why. But when it was created, they saw it from this direction, and it made perfect sense. So let's look at our road system from the other direction, the past, and maybe we'll solve some of today's riddles. Historic Calgary Week's theme this year, Unmasking the Past. Tonight we're going to do some of that, but we're also unmapping the past because this is based on old maps. We're stripping away layers and layers of new maps to find some of the oldest maps of Calgary. The first big influence on Calgary's layout, and the one that still has the greatest effect on our road system, was the Dominion Land Survey that reached Calgary in 1883. It created a system, a grid of imaginary lines across the West, regardless of the physical features. There were 6 lines running north and south called meridians. Between them were vertical strips called ranges. Ranges were divided into townships, 6 miles by 6 miles, or 36 square miles each. Follow the 5th meridian, and where does it go? Well, if you said through Calgary, you're right. Basically, that's Barlow Trail, 24th Street East. Do we have anything today that marks the 5th meridian? Well, if you said Meridian Road, then you know your city pretty well. Just off Barlow Trail, you can go there and buy a Subaru or a Volkswagen. So here is a township, 36 square miles. Each of those square miles is called a section, and they're numbered from 1 to 36, as shown on the map. Each section is divided into quarter sections, northwest, northeast, southeast, southwest. Between sections are road allowances. Now, if you lived in the country, you would still notice this grid everywhere around you. In the city, we don't think about it, but it's still there, and it still determines much of Calgary's layout. That's a good illustration of how many square miles Calgary occupies today. For example, here's one of the things that grid determines. Where did most of Calgary's main roads come from? Well, most of our main roads follow the section lines. When you drive up McLeod Trail or Deerfoot Trail, those are the interchanges. These ones are the avenues. And, just think about that. You're going up Deerfoot. There's Anderson, Southland, Heritage, Glenmore, and then we have 50th, 17th, Memorial, 16th, 32nd, McKnight, 64th. Those are the section lines. Here are the streets. Now I've turned this map sideways so that it fits on the screen. But these are the streets. And the names might change, but whether it's called Sarcee Trail, Home Road, or 53rd Street, it's all the same section line. If most of our main roads follow the section lines, many of our secondary roads are the half-section lines. Parcels of land are bought and sold in quarter sections or sections, and you can see how in older parts of the city, the districts fit neatly into the quarters. Middle-aged districts are more likely to occupy whole sections. In our newer districts, we got away from the grid, And it doesn't look like we follow the sections, and yet they still have a way of showing up, as you can see up there in Rocky Ridge. Anywhere you see straight lines on the map, chances are those are the section lines. Well, another thing that goes back to that first survey, why do we have trails in Calgary? Most cities, you don't find trails. Well, in Calgary, many of those really were trails, ruts in the grass. The grid was entirely artificial. Before most of Calgary was developed, people created routes to get them where they wanted to go, following the path of least resistance. Some of those trails are still with us today. The North Trail to Morleyville, the Methodist Mission to the Stoney Nakoda Nation, is today's Crowchild Trail, Highway 1A. The old trail to Edmonton is Edmonton Trail. The road we know as Memorial Drive was once called Blackfoot Trail because it was the trail to Blackfoot Crossing. The trail to Fort Macleod is, of course, Macleod Trail. Our Richmond Road was the trail to the Tsutina Reserve and the South Trail to Morleyville. And part of the Bow River Bottom Trail survives today as Bow Bottom Trail. The next big influence was the arrival of the Canadian Pacific Railway and its survey of the Calgary town site. Different survey. First, the CPR was given the odd-numbered sections along the route across the prairies. The first big effect of that on Calgary was that the CPR put its station in section 15, while the settlement was in section 14 in today's Inglewood. The whole town had to move across the river. I'm not sure whether I'm just wondering if my picture's blocking anything here. Anyway, the CPR hired surveyor Archibald McVitie to lay out a new town site so that they could start selling lots. Here's his survey of the first few avenues. This is now our downtown. McVitie's little map gave us a number of things that have always been important to Calgary. First, a grid system. Second, avenues that run east and west, and streets that run north and south. Third, rectangular blocks. They're not square, they're not hodgepodge shapes or anything like that. Number 4, absolutely brilliant. The 2 red lines are the section lines. That means they're 1 mile apart. And he's divided it up into 10 blocks. So basically 10 east-west blocks equals a mile, which is great for measuring distances. Fifth, he named the roads for CPR officials. Now they were later changed to numbers, but that's why today we have Stephen Avenue downtown. McVitie also gave us some of our mysteries. Why was 14th Street once called First Street? Why is 13th Street only 2 blocks long? Why is there no 3rd Street south of the tracks? Why does 16th Avenue disappear? Why is Tompkins Square a triangle? Well, they all come down to the same thing. Here's the whole map, the way that McVitie completed it. Instead of making the avenues parallel to the section lines, shown in red, he made them parallel to the railway tracks, which are about 3 degrees out from the section lines. Then he made the streets perpendicular to the avenues rather than to the section lines. This made sense at the time, but it caused problems when these roads were extended into adjoining sections. So let's look at the next section to the west, section 16. This was Crown land, and the federal government hired McVitie to do their survey too for this section. On the right is what we call 4th Street, or what he had called Ross. It runs north and south because it's a section line, but all the other streets and avenues are not parallel to them. They're parallel to the ones that McVitie had created in the previous section. Now on government land, he couldn't very well name the roads after CPR officials, so he's numbered them. But look what he's done. He's numbered the streets in the opposite direction from what we're used to. So our 14th Street today was his 1st Street. 13th Street was 2nd Street, and so on up to 11th. Well, by the time of this 1891 map, Calgary had been incorporated as a town, with the town limits being the 3 sections that are outlined here. And now we can see why 13th Street is only 2 blocks long. and why there is no 3rd Street south of the tracks. Thanks to McVitie, as the streets converged with the section lines, the blocks would get so small they wouldn't be feasible. Likewise, down here, 16th Avenue disappears east of 7th Street. And then there's that pretty little triangular park on 17th Avenue. The Tompkins family donated that to the city as a park in 1916 because what else could they do with it? For some reason, it got named Tompkins Square, which I think is funny because it's so obviously a triangle. As the city grew, extending all these off-kilter lines would have become ridiculous. So south of 17th Avenue and north of the Bow River, later surveyors made streets and avenues parallel to the section lines. Why does the Louise Bridge jog from 10th Street to 9th Street? Why does the Reconciliation Bridge jog toward the east? Well, Calgary only had 2 bridges over the Bow. On the west was the Bow Marsh Bridge to Morleyville, and the Langevin, or now Reconciliation Bridge, on Edmonton Trail. In the days before reinforced concrete, you built a bridge as short as possible, which meant crossing perpendicular to the river beneath. And if the bridge stood on piers in the river, if the piers weren't parallel to the current, they would create eddies, making the river dangerous for boating. The original bridges are long gone, but their replacements closely follow the original locations. Why are Inglewood and Ramsey full of strange intersections and angles? And why are there a Maggie Street and a Margaret Street, and they're only 4 blocks apart? Well, this was the location of the original pre-railway settlement east of the Elbow River. The southwest quarter and the southeast quarter were bought from the original squatters by speculators Wesley Orr and John Stewart, respectively. Each one had his quarter surveyed. Well, 2 developers plus 2 surveyors equals inconsistency. Because of this bend in the Bow River, Stewart changed the angle of his avenues. This left 9th Avenue sharply angled toward the section line at 15th Street East. And they intersected 9th Avenue and 17th Avenue, intersected right there at 15th Street. Now, therefore, then they made the streets perpendicular to the avenues. And therefore, Stewart's 12th Avenue intersects Orr's 11th Avenue. 11th Avenue is the half section line, so it became the main road south. But 12th Street got the ferry and later the bridge to St. George's Island, so it became the main street north of the intersection with 11th. The area around New Street has a different pattern because the river turned again, and Stewart wanted to sell estate lots backing onto the Bow River. Down here in the south corner, or the southwest part of Inglewood, is on yet another angle, and the reason there is that the streets run parallel to what was originally McLeod Trail. Today that's called Spiller Road and 8th Street, but that was the original McLeod Trail. Streets in this area still bear the name of Orr's daughters, Maggie, over here, where's my coat? There it is, Maggie and Adelaide. Now, a little farther south, the next district down was called, there it is, Ramsey, named after its developer, William Ramsey. He named the streets there after his children, Margaret, Elizabeth, Alexander, Constance. So there's Maggie Street named after Orr's daughter and Margaret Street named after Ramsey's daughter, and they're only 4 blocks apart. In Inglewood, why is the front of Colonel Walker School on 9th Avenue, but the back is on 22nd Avenue? Surely that school is not 13 blocks long. Well, the 2 grid systems had to meet somewhere, and this is where they met. Now, wherever the 2 angles meet, or the 2 grid systems meet, you will see idiosyncrasies like the intersection of 20th Avenue and 10th Avenue, or the intersection of 20th Street and 17th Street. Why does the Mission District have French street names? more accurately, I should say French avenue names. And why were our biggest industries outside the city? Well, when Calgary became a city, it still had the boundaries of the 3 original sections. But look at what was outside the city limits. Rouleauville was a separate Catholic and mostly French-speaking village around the Catholic Mission. Today it's called the Mission District. The Eau Claire Lumber Company, the brewery, the Burns Meatpacking Plant, and the stockyards, 4 of Calgary's biggest industries, all had geographical reasons to locate where they did. For the lumber company, logs were floated down the Bow River. For the brewery, there was an underground spring. The railway junction here transported raw materials and products north, south, east, and west. But you also have to wonder if these businesses weren't just avoiding municipal taxes. Why is Center Street center when it's not in the middle? Why is there no Center Avenue downtown? Why were there once 4 First Streets? Well, in 1904, the city adopted our numbering system. McTavish Street became Center Street. That's the red one, because it faced the railway station, which was the most important building in town. That's the Green Star. Today, that's the Calgary Tower. The streets on either side were numbered upwards from 1. So you got First Street West, First Street East, Second Street West, Second Street West, and so on. Avenues started at the section line below the river. It was numbered first rather than center because it really was the first avenue. There wasn't a middle one, like there had been a middle street. Therefore, you got 2 firsts. This was really the First Avenue. Today, it's called First Avenue, Eau Claire Avenue, and Riverfront Avenue, but nowhere is it called Center Avenue south of the Bow River. Why were there 4 First Streets? Well, this one's pretty strange. There was now First Street East and First Street West. That's 2. Remember how McVitie had numbered 14th Street as First Street? Well, at least in people's minds, that still made 3. Meanwhile, outside the city, William Nimmons was subdividing his ranch, what we now call Bankview, and he numbered his streets from 1 to 5. So he too had a First Street. But since people still thought of 14th Street as First Street, he differentiated by numbering his as First Street West. That means that until this area was annexed by the city years later and became 14A Street, we had 2 First Street Wests a whole mile apart. In 1907, the city extended its boundaries, and this led to the next set of mysteries. How do you number the avenues north of the Bow? Well, you could use negative numbers, or you could start a quadrant system with First Avenue north of the river, as well as the original First Avenue south of the river. They chose quadrants. So now there's an intersection of First Avenue and First Street in 4 different parts of the city, 1 in each quadrant: northwest, northeast, southeast, and southwest. This makes perfect sense to you and me, but we drive tourists crazy with our signs that say things like 14th Street West, South, North. Why do the avenues immediately north of the Bow River have names instead of numbers? Sorry, wrong way. Well, now we were expanding north of the river. So just as Center Street was the dividing line between east and west, we now needed a line to divide north from south. It was too late to rename First Avenue south of the river. That would have changed the numbers of everything else in the city. But north of the river, the same section line was named Center Avenue. Same line, 2 different names, 2 different numbers. This created problems, as you can imagine. Having Center Avenue up here created several South Avenues north of the river. Mass confusion. This lasted for 18 years, till in 1925, they changed the quadrant line to the Bow River rather than Center Avenue, and they gave the roads names instead of numbers. Center Avenue became Kensington Road, and then we have Westmount, Bowness, and Broadview, and Westmount Boulevard. Over in Bridgeland, on the other side of Center, there's McDougall and Meredith and McPherson. So where the rest of the city went from names to numbers, these two areas went from numbers to names. Today, you can still find traces of how the city tried to cover up the evidence that these northeast roads had once been southeast. If the city had continued using the Center Avenue quadrant line, today we would call Wildwood, Coach Hill, Patterson, and Cougar Ridge northwest instead of southwest. That would have been confusing too. So eventually they changed the quadrant line to the Bow River and the Trans-Canada Highway. And this area became southwest. That also explains why Bowness is called northwest, even though it's south of the Bow River. This leads to the mystery of Calgary's most widely spaced avenues. This is kind of a confusing map, so I've tried to color code everything. The red lines show the alignment of Center Avenue in the west side of the city, but nowhere in the west side of the city is it called Center Avenue. It's First Avenue, then Kensington Road, then Spruce Drive, then becomes Bow Trail. The yellow line shows 17th Avenue. But look what happens to the avenues north of 17th. 8th Avenue in Westgate is south of 9th Avenue downtown. That goes back to McVitie putting things on that 3-degree angle. So 8th Avenue by this distance is actually south of 9th Avenue. By the time you get to Aspen Woods, 14th Avenue is south of 9th Avenue downtown. 11th Avenue is north of Center Avenue. And in West Springs, 9th Avenue is a full mile north of 9th Avenue downtown. Why do some roads have a name on the sidewalk and a number on the street sign? Hint, you'll notice that both sidewalks were paved in 1910. And you'll also notice that not everyone knew how to spell. There's quite a number of spelling mistakes in our sidewalks around Calgary. 1910 city engineer's map shows that even though numbers were now used in the original Calgary, the city planned to use names in the newly annexed areas. For example, here's Balmoral and Mountview, and the roads there were intended to get biblical names. We've got Esau, Isaac, Jacob, Joshua, Matthew spelled wrong, Mark, Luke, John, Esther spelled wrong. We've got Moses and Jeremiah. And if you happen to live on First Street East, that was to be named Judas Street. Now just imagine living on Judas Street. This policy ended because in 1911, the very, very wise residents of Crescent Heights, which had been newly annexed, petitioned City Council to use numbers there. Council saw the wisdom of consistency, so numbers became citywide, but not before a few sidewalks had already been stamped with names, like Lindquan Avenue. So that was the end of Lindquan Avenue and Judas Street. Why do we have A streets? Well, in some areas, like the circled one, the developers decided to run the blocks north and south instead of east and west. That made twice as many streets and half as many avenues. Didn't matter with the avenues, they could still match, but the street numbers had to match up with the street numbers in the rest of the city. So the result was A streets. 7A is kind of like saying 7.5 Street. This worked with a couple of exceptions. If you're 6.5 blocks west of Center Street, you call it 6A Street West. If you're 6.5 blocks east of Center Street, you call it 6A Street East. But Center Street itself is neither east nor west. To avoid the confusion of a Center A Street Northeast and a Center A Street Northwest, the city went with Center A and Center B, one on each side. Why did Mount Royal become our first theme district, with roads having names from Canadian history? Well, Mount Royal is an odd-numbered section. It was owned by the CPR, who envisioned a luxury district here. Most of the first mansions on the hill were owned by American businessmen, so naturally Calgarians started calling it American Hill. That didn't sit well with the CPR land agent and his friend R.B. Bennett, future Prime Minister, who appealed to the CPR's lands commissioner. He agreed, named the hill Mount Royal after the exclusive park in Mount Royal, which also happened to be the Canadian Pacific's head office, so there may have been some sucking up going on here. And he gave the roads Canadian history names: Joliet, Verchères, Lévis, Valois, Cartier. Then he laughed and said, "Let the Yanks try to pronounce those names." Now came the big boom. Between 1901 and 1911, Calgary's population went up tenfold, from 4,000 to over 40,000. The land annexed in 1907 wasn't enough. So the city expanded again in 1910, only 3 years later. So in a 3-year period, they've gone from 3 square miles to 36 square miles. I've circled the number 36 up at the top. Does that number sound familiar? If you look down at the bottom, there's number 1 in that circle. And if you're putting all this together, the city simply took in the whole township, sections 1 to 36. Surely 36 square miles would be enough for any future growth. Well, hardly. The boom appeared unstoppable, and developers snapped up land in sections and quarter sections and planned new communities out on the prairie, both inside and inside the new city limits. There was Happy Land and Kitsilano, the Bronx, Winona Heights, and in a cruel joke, next to the Tsuut'ina Nation was the district of Hiawatha. Lots went up in value, literally, by the day. Some buyers built on their lots, but speculators and absentee landlords didn't. They simply held on to their land, waiting for it to go up in value when everybody else built there. But if everybody was doing the same thing, hardly anybody else built there. The crash came in 1913, and people were left holding land that was basically worthless. Most of those plans fell through, and those areas weren't developed until after World War II. You can see the reality in the picture on the right. Well, several of our mysteries happened in this boom period, but these ones this time weren't due to glitches in the system. In most of these cases, stuff just happened. The dots are the mysteries that I'm going to talk about now, going from east to west and north to south. In Greenview Industrial Park, why is 41st Avenue Northeast on a 45-degree angle? Avenues aren't supposed to do that. And why does 6th Street Northeast make this funny little unnecessary jog? Especially since that's the section line. Well, that's because 41st Avenue was the original route of Edmonton Trail. Today, Edmonton Trail has moved over to the west where the dotted line is. That's because once they built the airport, they didn't want you driving over the runways to get to Edmonton. The angled part was renamed 41st Avenue for some reason. The jog on 6th Street was put there to avoid Nose Creek, and you need a real old map to see that. Nose Creek made several big meanders, but today the creek has been straightened and contained, and it follows the light blue line. The jog in the road is still there, even though the creek isn't. Why is there a round park in Balmoral at 2nd Street and 19th Avenue Northwest? Again, this goes back to the boom. You can see on the 1913 map a little traffic circle. I'm guessing that some hopeful developer thought he might get a streetcar loop there, like the one in Tuxedo Park, a little bit to the north. The Tuxedo Loop, by the way, is now the Tuxedo Park Community Center. The Balmoral Loop never happened, and in this 1924 air photo, the circle is only half complete. Will the circle be unbroken by and by, Lord, by and by? Yes, because in the 1930s, Calgary's Parks Commissioner, Park Superintendent William Reeder, finished it off as a park. Today it's called Balmoral Circus, and I believe that it's now just recently been closed to traffic. If you're interested in things like this, former Mayor Don McKay the one who instituted the white hat tradition in the 1950s, lived in one of the homes on the northeast corner. And the lady who lives there is very proud to tell you all about it if you happen to find her outside. Now, off to the northwest. Why are so many things in the northwest inner city parallel to each other, but they're on a strange angle? Well, if you looked at the original 1913 plan, what you would see is the traditional grid going relentlessly uphill and down dale, completely ignoring the physical geography. And yet today, the most striking thing about these 6 sections is that the main roads, the parks, and districts are parallel to each other, but on this angle to the grid. That's because after the crash, reality set in and geography won. Geography means Nose Hill, a small part of which shows up here at the top of 14th Street. Now, by the way, how on earth did some developer come up with the name Bayville for the area by Nose Hill? Anyway, today the lower reaches of Nose Hill determine the layout of this whole area. The original plan completely ignored the thick green line, which was a ravine with a little swamp at the bottom. Today, this is a green swath that runs all the way from Highland Park through Queen's Park Cemetery, Confederation Park, and the Confederation Park Golf Course. Likewise, the roads follow the contours of Nose Hill, too. John Laurie Boulevard, Northmount Drive, Crowchild Trail, and Morleyville Road, which is still called Morley Trail today. If any of you went to William Aberhart High School, you were on a very historic trail. Morleyville Trail was the highway to Banff, but in the 1950s, of course, 16th Avenue down here became the Trans-Canada Highway. The old highway is now Crowchild Trail, or Highway 1A. And what's now called Banff Trail, which is this purple dashed line, is a new connector that joined the 2 highways, and the resulting triangle was the perfect place to put Motel Village. Now let's see that as an air photo. You can clearly see the influence of Nose Hill. All those red stars are the things that we just talked about. Okay, down to Hillhurst. Why does Gladstone Road run on an angle? And why does it make that funny little extra kink? Well, if you look at a 1908 map, on the right is 10th Street, in those days called Morleyville Road. And you'll still find today Morleyville Road Baptist Church. Today it's called Life Sport. I think it's still called Life Sport. And look at that, it's facing right onto a big slough. Well, it was easier to build the road around the slough than to drain the slough and follow the grid. And these folks got lakefront property. Then they changed the angle slightly so that it would intersect the section lines at 14th Street and Kensington Road. Memorial Drive goes right across the city and then suddenly becomes Parkdale Boulevard, then 3rd Avenue, then Bowness Road. Why? Well, it could have been worse. What is now Memorial Drive was at that time 6 separate sections of a road most people just called Boulevard. In 1922, there was Blackfoot Trail, Riverside Boulevard, Sunnyside Boulevard, Broadview Boulevard, Westmont Boulevard, Parkdale Boulevard. In 1922, the city renamed Riverside and Sunnyside Boulevards Memorial Drive. The First World War had just ended, and the city planted hundreds of trees along the road, each with a marker to honor a Calgary soldier killed in World War I. In 1963, not until then, the whole thing to achieve consistency was named Memorial Drive, except for Parkdale Boulevard. And I wish I could give you an answer for that. But that could have been worse too. It could have been Happy Land Boulevard, which was Parkdale's original name. But then, instead of following Parkdale Boulevard's actual route along the Bow River, the main route follows 3rd Avenue, and Parkdale Boulevard turns into kind of a back lane, and it ends up in the Edworthy Park parking lot. That's because 3rd Avenue was the streetcar line, and it was already there when they did the renaming. And it's also because the city limit was here at 37th Street. So in Calgary, they used the grid system, or they used our number system and our name system. But across the road there, they didn't need to do that. That was prairie and wasn't part of the city. But it was the road to Bowness. And by 1963, you're not going to change the name of the road to Bowness. It's still Bowness Road. Another mystery is Bankview. This one is actually quite hilarious. The eastern part of Bankview has a grid that is just a nightmare. It's completely disjointed. How could that be? Well, this half section was the ranch of William Nimmons. We mentioned him before. It was just outside Calgary city limits. From time to time, as he needed money, Nimmons would sell off little bits of his land, usually less than 5 acres at a time. In 1886, he sold the parcel that's outlined in blue to the president of the Hamilton Powder Company. Now, powder not as in makeup, but as in ammunition. This became an ammunition storage dump. I was for surplus Northwest Rebellion ordnance, Northwest Mounted Police ammunition storage, dynamite for local sandstone quarries, and so on, whatever else. On old maps, it's actually labeled the Powder Magazine, and for years afterwards, there were serious doubts about its safety. Through it, at an angle, ran a trail from the Tsutina Reserve to Calgary. It was known eventually as the Magazine Trail because it went through the Powder Magazine, but that explains why 19th Avenue still today veers off and intersects 20th Avenue, right outside the old Children's Hospital. The Powder Magazine's next owners subdivided it, gave it the name Royal Sonalta, and Nimmons went on selling little parcels of land. He eventually sold off maybe a dozen of them, and he ended up as the lord of his own little fiefdom. And the new buyers put roads wherever they felt like it, as you can see. Now here's the same place turned sideways. In 1905, Nimmons surveyed the rest of his land, subdivided it all, started selling it off. When he did his survey, his new roads didn't always line up with the roads on the land he had previously sold. In fact, very seldom did they line up with those roads, and not all the roads were completed at the same time. Additional streets were put in some places. So 2 years later, when the city finally annexed it and numbered it, they end up with many A streets and even a B street. But here's the funny part. It goes 16, 16A, 16B, 17, 17B, 17A, 18. I don't know why 17A and B are reversed from what we would normally expect. Actually, the funniest part of all, 17th Street, has 5 different alignments in this very short number of blocks. Why does Crowchild Trail make the big S curve south of 17th Avenue? Well, further west on Nimmons' property, in the area shown by the outer green lines, was an old stream bed and a gully with sandstone outcroppings. Nimmons used that as a sandstone quarry, stone from which built several of our sandstone buildings, including Sonalta School right here, which you drive by on Crowchild. It's the big old school that's got the more modern edition with a mural painted on the side. Over the years, Scarborough, the districts of Scarborough and Nob Hill grew up till only a little of the quarry site was left undeveloped, and that's marked by the inner green lines. In 1967, they built Crowchild Trail, and the quarry disappeared under the new road, which is the black line. That's because the road followed the quarry in a sweeping S-curve because it caused the least disruption to houses. They didn't have to take down all these houses that were on 24th Street. Why is 33rd Avenue the main road through Marda Loop when 34th is the section line? Well, this one's hard to see, but 34th Avenue dead ends at both ends. To the east, it hits a park, a hill, and the Elbow Park Community Association. 33rd, on the other hand, turns into Council Way, which eventually can connect you to Elbow Drive, and you can go across the city on it. At the west end, 34th dead ends again. But 33rd angles off across Crowchild Trail, and on its south side is Richmond Green. So why did 34th dead end? Well, because what is now Richmond Green used to be the city's reservoir before they built Glenmore, as you can see in this 1924 air photo. The water came into the reservoir in a wooden pipeline from the Elbow River in the area that's now Highway 8. Now you can also see the old South Trail to Morley, which today is Richmond Road. Well, with 34th Avenue impassable at both ends, 33rd became the main road. But 34th got the streetcar line, and there was a turnaround loop near the MARTA Theater, and that gave us the name MARTA Loop. Why does 6th Street make a jog around Lougheed House? Well, there was a little bog where 6th Street was supposed to go. Senator Lougheed owned a parcel of land across the bog to the east, so he arranged a land swap with the city so that they could move the street to dry land, and he got the bog and turned it into the beautiful sunken garden that has now been restored. Signs on 5th Street say that it was formerly College Road. There's also a College Lane just to the west, but there's no college. How did that come about? Well, today it's called Western Canada High School, and it's up where the red star is. But it began as Western Canada College. It was a private school for boys and young men, where the star is on the 1905 map. It's hard to read, but sure enough, it's called College Road. In 1912, the college subdivided, needed money, and sold some of its land. And that's the red box on this map, 1913. So College Road no longer touched the college, and the city now renamed it 5th Street. Now, this is kind of fun, I think, too. If you look really closely, College Road went all the way up the hill, still called College Road. Today we call that Hillcrest Avenue. That is the very top of Mount Royal. And if that was still called College Road, that would be a real mystery. Well, today the west edge of the property is called College Lane. And as you can see, it really was a back lane on the 1905 map. When the land was sold, the eastern edge got the hopeful name of University Street. They hoped that Western Canada College might become the university, but it was not to be. So today it is 5A Street. Why don't the avenues in the Mission District line up? It's really strange if you're walking there. It looks like it's all the same district. Why wouldn't they make the avenues match up? Well, this goes back to our old friend Archibald McVitie. Mission was surveyed in 1887 for its owner, the Catholic Church. He made the avenues parallel to the ones he had already surveyed up here in Calgary. They were named in French after Catholic missionaries and saints. The section across 4th Street, different section, was owned by the CPR, and it was surveyed almost 20 years later by A.P. Patrick. By that time, avenues were being made parallel to the section lines, like 17th Avenue. And so that's why the avenues in Mission don't quite connect. These ones were named after governors general, named, of course, in English. And this area became known as Mount Royal Extension. It's in the same section as Mount Royal and is technically a part of Mount Royal. However, in the 1920s, it came to be known as Cliff Bungalow, named after the school, the public school located on Cliff Street. And that's why technically it is still to this day 2 different districts, even though, and that's why, by the way, on the signs, it will say Cliff Bungalow Mission Heritage District. Okay, I look in an old directory for those beautiful old houses on Elbow Drive, some of the big mansions. And there is no Elbow Drive, but I know the houses were there in those days. What's happened? Well, sometimes the city changes the names of roads, fortunately not too often. The avenue that curves along the river west of the 4th Street Safeway in Mission was called Elgin Avenue. I said it was named after Governors General. Below that, down about here, it turned into 6th Street, and then there was 6A and 7th Streets. But in the early 1930s, I don't know why, Elgin Avenue became Elbow Drive, and it became Elbow Drive all the way along. 6th Street was moved over, at least the name 6th Street was moved over. 6A was changed to 6th, 7th is still there. While we're on Elbow Drive, I've always liked this distinctive Spanish-style house on the corner of Elbow Drive and Sifton Boulevard. Part of its mystique is this little triangular island that separates it from the corner. What's that for? Well, maybe you've guessed by now. Until 1910, that was the city limit, and it was another streetcar loop. That was the loop for routes 2 and 3. Route 3 is Elbow Drive, still is today. Route 2 was Mount Pleasant. Yeah, Mount Pleasant. Why does Ogden Road make so many bends? Well, Ogden Road is the dark blue line. It could have been pretty straightforward if only it could have followed the alignment of what today is called Bonnybrook Road, but it couldn't because the Canada Malt and Grain Elevator got in the way. In those days, Bonnybrook Road was called Sinnott Road. The name was changed a little later. Here's why. It was named after the mayor at the time, Mayor Sinnott. He was a former high school principal, and then he became a lawyer. He ended up serving 7 years in jail for defrauding his clients. I guess you could say he was a principal without principles. Anyway, because the grain elevator blocked the route, the streetcar to the Ogden shops had to follow several other roads, including 42nd Avenue, which was the half-section line. But today the route has moved up to 40th Avenue, and the whole thing, rather than name every road individually, has just been named Ogden Road. Well, getting up to more modern times, after the discovery of oil at Leduc, so starting in the 1950s, the city began another period of great growth and expansion. Now everybody had a car. There was no need to keep the city compact so that you could use public transit or walk to work. The result was the abandonment of the grid, which wasn't, of course, just happening in Calgary. That was the trend all over. So now we went for sweeping crescents, drives, and cul-de-sacs. Here is Sarcee Trail, the red line in the middle. And you can see the dramatic difference between the two sides of Sarcee Trail. Notice on the left how the density has been reduced. Today, our city planners are trying to increase density again because this just is not sustainable going on and on like what's on the left side. Well, leaving the grid meant that a lot of things became mysteries. Without numbered streets and avenues, it was desirable that the names in new districts should make it obvious which district they were in. So now we got mysterious names. What's a Varbay or a Varshaven, or is it Varshaven? I remember when they were planning Midnapore and Mayor Sykes had good sense of humor. He suggested, how about midriff, midsection, midwife? Those didn't happen. But next step was to get names that made sense. So to get names that made sense, we did this. Coming off Wood Park Boulevard, we have 12 other wood parks. Well, Wood Park's a really nice name, but which one did your Amazon delivery go to? Here's a fairly recent mystery. Why are there ghost roads with trees even in Linwood Ridge? The former roads have been removed and they're almost invisible now. But as recently as 2002, they showed up very clearly, minus any houses. Some of you I know the answer to this mystery. Here's a clue. The area to the north below the hill is called Old Refinery Park. Well, the refinery's big tanks, this was the Imperial Oil Refinery, the big tanks were up on the ridge at the top of the hill, the yellow line. They looked down on the rest of the refinery. The refinery was removed in 1976, and then they built houses on the ridge. Great view. And then it was discovered that the land was severely contaminated. You'd think they would have thought of that, but we didn't think about things like that in those days. The lower area was remediated and became Old Refinery Park, but the situation on the ridge was much worse because by now it was covered with houses. Imperial had to buy out 140 homeowners, demolish their houses, and then remove the contaminated soil. The result was ghost roads with trees and even the odd foundation still poking up. Well, we're still creating mysteries that will puzzle future Calgarians. Your grandchildren will say, "Grandma, which general is General Avenue named after?" And you'll say, well, if you guessed, it's named after the old General Hospital. And then you say to your grandchild, "I was born there." Your grandchild's going to say, "Grandma, you're so smart." Unless they say, "Grandma, you're so old." Your high school grandkids are going to say, "Why does everything in Garrison Woods have First World War names?" And you'll say, "Because before it was the new district of Garrison Woods, it was military housing for Canadian Forces Base Calgary." And your grandkids will say, "My grandpa knows everything." Well, here's a brand new mystery that I want to leave you with. Almost every city in North America has a main street and a market street. Where are they in Calgary? Give you a second to think about that. And if you guessed down in Seaton, right outside the South Health Campus, you're right. Main and Market on the edge of the prairie. Well, it's on the map. There's the intersection with dotted lines, meaning it wasn't built at the time of that map. But even on the new maps, it's now real lines. But if you go there, the actual intersection of Main and Market isn't built yet. But there is a Main Street, there it is on the sign, and there is a Market Street. And Calgary now has a Main and a Market, just like San Francisco. You know? Okay, well, maybe you have some of your own favorite road riddles and some map mysteries. And I hope this talk will inspire you to figure some of them out and to realize that even as we drive around in a modern city, history is always trying to speak out to us. Thank you very much.
We do have a few questions, so let's start with that. Christine asked, what is the section name of the properties?
If only I had my map in front of me. There were so many districts, I can't tell you. No, I'd be guessing. I don't want to guess. I do know where McCall Lake is, which would be just north of the properties, just south of McKnight Boulevard. McCall Lake Golf Course, that was intended as a residential district to be called Lakeview Heights.
Thank you. Marianne asked, is Westmount a community unto itself, or is it formerly part of the West Hillhurst community?
That depends which map you look on. And I think it is a community unto itself. West Hillhurst used to be Grand Trunk, and now they combined into West Hillhurst, but I don't know that that's added West Hillhurst. Sorry, that's added Westmount. Again, sorry, I'm guessing on some of these.
No.
My map is about 5 feet by 5 feet, and I can't spread it out on the table here.
Thank you. We have a question from Sherry. When did the city annex the Niemann's estate and renumber the roads?
That was annexed in 1907. That would have been part of the 1907 edition. And so that's when they renumbered. Niemann's had subdivided it in 1905. Actually, on the corner of 14th Street and 17th Avenue, is still a building called Nimitz Corner. That was his real estate office. He built that as his real estate office to sell his district.
Yes, and is that that would be, I'm trying to think now, southwest corner of 17th
Yes.
Avenue and 4th,
Yes,
right?
that's right. And if you
Yeah.
go 2 blocks up the hill, you
Mhm.
come to the Nimitz house, that big, beautiful Queen Anne brick house with the turret that has just been lifted up and moved across the lot
Yeah.
so that they can build condos all around it.
It's
it's
happening
been
right
saved.
now. Yes. Yeah. Next question is, might you be able to provide some details and reasons for the division between southwest and southeast, going south from downtown, Center Street South? Then McLeod Trail might be missing some division points. Thanks for the interesting presentation.
McLeod Trail is not straight, and that causes a whole lot of issues with McLeod Trail. Remember that McLeod Trail was there as soon as they built Fort Calgary. Supplies came up from Fort McLeod on the McLeod Trail. And so it's really not McLeod Trail's fault that it's not straight. And then it curved over, went through Inglewood on what's now Spiller Road. So it was in the it was fairly late. They made 2nd Street East into McLeod Trail. So in the downtown, 2nd Street East works like a street. But when you hit McLeod Trail, it does that for a little bit more distance. Then you get to Cemetery Hill and it starts wandering. And so in some places it's southeast, in other places it's southwest.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there is a real dividing line that's a real road. It would be an imaginary line.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. There's a question about the General Hospital. Why was it called General Hospital?
Because it treated all kinds of things, I guess. It's not the original General Hospital. That was down near the Stampede grounds on 12th Avenue, where those sandstone ruins are now. That was our General Hospital.
Mm-hmm.
Then when they built the new one, which was it became the old one. In 1910, they built the new one in Bridgeland, and the old one became the isolation hospital. So they now had 2 hospitals. There was also another smallpox hospital up on 16th Avenue. And so to distinguish the 3 hospitals, 2 of them were specialty hospitals. The general was a general hospital. It served all purposes. That came down in the early 50s when they built the general. Some of us remember. Some of us were born in.
Mm-hmm.
Some of us were mad when they blew it up.
Thank you. We have a question from Cynthia. These offset intersections are so difficult for traffic and pedestrians. Did the city express concerns about these unresolved intersections? Attempt to mitigate?
I have never heard that the city did that at all. Remember that when these happened, cars were very new and there weren't very many of them. And I don't know that it wouldn't be as big an issue as it is now. Certainly it is now.
Mm-hmm.
I've never heard that anybody worried about that.
Thank you. And also from Cynthia and Bob, I guess. How about giving this talk to city roads planners? They would be fascinated and enlightened.
If they invite me, I'll come. Hi, Cynthia and Bob. Haven't seen you guys for ages.
Thank you. And another question is, tell us about the role of the Olmsted Landscape Company and street design. Thank you, Doug.
Oh dear. I know who you should ask. I don't know whether I dare mention his name or not. I'm not the expert on that, and I don't know. If you contact me, I'll contact my friend who does probably know that.
Thank you. There is no name here, just it says Heritage Committee. So I don't see, actually, there's just one more question that came in. I live in Richmond, Nob Hill. Do you know why this community has two names? And actually, I do live in that community too, and I was wondering about this too. Thank you for asking that.
Communities were much smaller in those days. Like it could be a quarter section, not even a half section. That's my guess. I don't know the reason. I don't even know who would have named those, whether William Nimmons would have named those or not. They were part of his ranch. That's where the sandstone quarry was. He had a brick works over there. I don't know. And Nob Hill, the famous Nob Hill's in San Francisco, and it's NOB Hill, whereas ours is KNOB. Mm-hmm. Maybe because it looks like a knob. I don't know. That's bizarre to me, but there it is. I don't know why it's two separate names. Sinalta, as you may have noticed on that map, that is now called Scarborough. Most of what was called Sinalta. Mm-hmm. And Sinalta today we think of as more down the hill, whereas Scarborough is the part on the hill and up the hill. Names change. I don't know why. Also, part of Scarborough is across Crowchild Trail, because when they built Crowchild, that bisected the community basically.
And that's another confusion. I'm adding this. Another confusion for me, for Richmond Nob Hill, is that it's such a small, narrow part on the west side of Crowchild, and then starts Killarney, which is big. And somehow when you tell people, it's almost easier to say it's Killarney because it would make more sense that it's all just Killarney. But yeah.
I know what you mean. I live in Woodlands, and it's way easier to just tell people it's Woodland or Woodbine.
Yeah, then exactly. Yes. Well, thank you. Another question: Are the 1911 census numbered addresses comparable to today's numbered addresses?
Most of them, yes. Almost all of them, I believe, would be. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are places, when the boom collapsed, after the city had taken in all that land and you got all those developers hopefully developing things, when the boom collapsed, most of that was empty space. And even though a lot of those had been surveyed, I'm thinking here of Glenbrook community, that area. AP Patrick had that all surveyed, but it didn't amount to anything. Most of that ends up reverting to the city in lieu of taxes. People didn't want to pay the taxes or couldn't pay the taxes. And at some point, the city resurveyed them. So you may have had a house, there might have been like one house on an entire street in some of those areas. That house might have been numbered, and it might have been renumbered when the city resurveyed it. But most things that were in that area were probably, the numbers would have been kept.
And there is a comment from Elizabeth saying there were 250 subdivisions during the 1912 land boom in Calgary. Herald published the list. There is also, go ahead, sorry.
That's amazing. Yeah.
There is another comment from Patricia. I grew up in Bankview, and I remember the Indigenous people using Richmond Road and 19th Avenue to travel down to the Stampede and Indian Village. My father called it Magazine Trail, but no one else did. He said that they used it to walk and angle to 9th Avenue, which goes to CP Rail, where they received yearly allotments, Flower, and further east to Fort Calgary.
What a great memory. What a great story.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. And another question we have is, why are some addresses listed in Henderson's directory as West Calgary?
That's a good question too. I don't know. I'm going to hazard a guess here. If you were west of the city limits, which at that time, let's say 37th Street, there were houses out there. They weren't part of the city, And it was actually called Spruce Vale. And then west of Spruce Vale was Springbank, and those were rural areas. But maybe if you lived in the city, maybe if you wanted your name in the directory, you would have said West Calgary. I don't know. I mean, there's a district called South Calgary still today, but I don't think there's one called West Calgary.
Mm-hmm. True. Thank you. We still have some time. If you have more questions from Doug, please send them to us. Thank you so much, Doug.
You're very
on
welcome.
behalf of the library, thank you. That was a very interesting presentation.
Thanks, Zaricha, and thank you, Doug, very much for another very interesting presentation. You've dug into a lot of dusty corners in the city and found some really interesting stuff. I know Mayor Nenshi is always a tough act to follow, but you were patient again. So, and I'd like to thank all of you for joining us tonight at the Kickoff, Historic Calgary Week. Please remember to check out our website at chinookhistory.ca for more information regarding all of the Historic Calgary Week programs.